Hi everyone, welcome to Triangle Community Center's Virtual Pride Week. Give me just 1 second and we will get the program started. So today we're going to be talking about LGBT film and television, a brief history. Before we get started, I would like to welcome you all to Virtual Pride Week from Triangle Community Center in Norwalk, Connecticut. I would also like to congratulate TCC on 30 years of involvement and assistance to the LGBT community and their allies throughout Fairfield County. So congratulations TCC and happy Virtual Pride Week to everyone. I'd also like to mention that this week there's a social media campaign going on in conjunction with Virtual Pride Week. Today is yellow, the color of the rainbow flag, and I'm wearing yellow. So if you would also put on some sort of yellow garment and tag yourself as at CT Pride Center on either Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram with the hashtag TCC 2020 Pride Week, and you'll get a chance to win a TCC rainbow shirt. So who am I? My name is Bahr, and I am head of adult services at Fairfield Public Library. So I'm a librarian, and I'm also a blogger. I blog online under the name of Real Charlie. I've been blogging for over 10 years, and I'm a film and television review blogger, and I have a real slant towards LGBT film and television, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing here today. So I created this program a number of years ago, and I presented it at Fairfield University, and I've also presented it at the library. So I'm so happy to be presenting it for TCC today with a huge amount of updated content for 2020. I have a huge passion for film and television, and specifically for LGBT film and television. It started out when I was younger. When I got into my 30s, it really sort of took off, and I started discovering all sorts of films. I spent some time at a really incredible video store in upstate New York, working there, called Alternative Videos of Woodstock, and that's where I got my film education. And then after grad school and becoming a librarian, I ended up doing a lot of the managing of the collection for film and also for television at both Fairfield U when I worked there and where I work now at Fairfield Public Library. So it continues to be a passion for me, which is why I started blogging 10 years about it. Also, I want to talk to you today about my identity and also my privilege, because I think that factors into how I present this program and also how I present in every day of my life. So I'm going to start off by saying that I'm white, I'm gay, I'm also HIV positive, I'm cisgender, and I'm a middle-aged man. So that's the way that I look through the world. I look through the world with that lens of all of those identities coming together. And the privilege that's behind some of those identities, there's a privilege behind being white, and there's a privilege behind being cisgender. So I look at the world through that lens, through a combination of that lens. So part of what we're going to be talking about today is having each one of us look at these films that we're going to talk about and see how do you relate to them as far as your identity goes, and then how do we as a collective community, the LGBT community and our allies, how do we look at these films as a whole, as either community within the gender and sexuality minority, or as human beings as a whole. So that's a little bit about where we're going to. Also a disclaimer that today's program is really an introduction. We're going to zoom through about 80 years of film and TV. So I'd love to have a course where it would be about 80 hours and we could spend an hour on each year, but we don't have that. So we're going to be flipping through a lot of things, but I'm going to give you examples of films to go and check out. And we will be covering sort of general themes. And then as we get closer and closer to the present day, the films that we talk about will be getting larger and larger. So we're going to start out really simply with some really broad strokes, and then get more and more intense and involved as we get closer and closer to 2020. So I hope that works for all of you, and let's keep going. So the first thing that I want to talk about is I feel like there's always going to be somebody out there that's going to say, well, aren't we post-LGBT? Just like they said when Obama got elected in 2008, aren't we post-race at this point? So I don't particularly think that we are post-LGBT in our personal lives, obviously, because there's still a lot of discrimination, and there's still a lot of work for full and national civil rights, and then international civil rights as well. So there's a lot of work to be happening. But within the context of what we're talking about today, within LGBT film and television, why do we need to worry about this? So I've got a clip here from Ellen that took place last summer with Janet Mock. So Janet Mock is a she's a television producer, writer, and director, and she's also a trans woman of color. And what she has to say about her work and why she does her work, I think is really telling, and it really sort of grounds us in the idea of what we want to move forward with today. So I'm going to play just a brief minute or so of this. Just let me get to the 4-minute mark once the video starts, and then we'll get going with this.
Hi. And then suddenly Ryan Murphy calls you and says he wants you to write, produce, and direct on television. And you said, okay.
It was the strangest interview to ever have. First of all, I was on the set of the assassination of Gianni Versace, American Crime Story. And it was a nightclub scene. I just remember there was like a disco ball in the air and like drag queens all over the place and shirtless, oiled up men. And I was like, this is the strangest interview that I've ever been on. But I was like, it's Hollywood. So I came in and he hired me on the spot, and it really just changed my life because I grew up watching television. I'm one of 5 kids, the middle of 5. My mom was a single working mom. The TV was a babysitter, like many people probably watching right now. And so to be able to finally create reflections of myself and my community, reflections and mirrors that I didn't have growing up, has been so deeply affirming and so gratifying for me. And so I just love being able to work on Pose and to tell these stories about these women and these people existing at that time period.
Yeah, it's called Pose, and it's amazing that this is your first journey into this, and you've written 2 books if you're interested in all, and just listen to the podcast that Oprah did also with Janet. It's your books, your story. There's so much to your story. We don't have time for all of it, but it's just, you're incredible. And I think we need more people just, on television and everywhere, just representing all of us, because we're all different, and you're brilliant. So thank you for being here. It's called Pose. It returns June 11th at 10 on FX. We'll be right back.
So that's Janet Mock, and I think that it's really great that she talked about seeing her reflection and people like her on TV, that sometimes the only way to do that is for people to change that, to people to come in there and shake things up. And so as we look at these last 80 years, we're going to see that filmmakers and producers and actors really pushed the envelope so that we could get to the point to where we are today.
Hi.
Oops. Okay, so the next slide. So why should we care about all of this? And I'm not saying that just to the LGBT people that are here today with us, or to the allies even that are here with us today. I'm talking about in general, like, why do we really care about seeing content, entertainment, media, TV, movies that are about things that are outside of our own space? So as this list says here on the slide, so why should we care about LGBT film and television, which is what we're talking about today? Why should we care about trans actors playing trans roles, which Janet has been a firm, not just a believer in, but she's actually made that happen for a lot of people. Why should we care about women directors, or female actors' paychecks, or African-American filmmakers, or Asian glass ceiling, or Latinx representation on television, or rural stories, or any of the massive amount of questions that you could say about, like, making sure that the world is inclusive, our own personal world as well as film and television? So I have an answer to that, and my answer is the title of a film. So my answer is the movie Monsoon Wedding from 2001. And let me just give you a synopsis of the film, and I think that'll give you an idea of why I think this is important. So Monsoon Wedding is a movie about 2 straight couples falling in love and marrying. It takes place in India. The characters are South Asian. One couple is upper middle class. The other is poor. So I'm not straight. I'm not married. I do not live in India. I'm not South Asian. And I'm neither upper middle class nor am I poor. But what I take away from this film every time I watch it is a connection to the universal human experiences of love and family. watching film and television outside of my comfort zone expands my understanding of our world. And so that really is what I feel is so important to all of us, to tell our stories, no matter who we are. But in particular, because we've been so shunned from film and TV over the course of the last 100 years, it's so important to continue for people who have alternate genders and gender and sexuality as in the world to really come out and talk about our lives with people. So what does LGBT, I'm talking about LGBT, and I know people say LGBTQ and some people say LGBTQ+. So I want to just make sure that we all are on the same page with this. So there is a huge amount of identities that are involved and are placed underneath this umbrella of LGBT, which is really an umbrella about gender and sexuality, right? So there's the top four that were the sort of the traditional four: lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And then there's queer and questioning, and there's ally and asexual and intersex and pansexual and two-spirit, and the plus means everybody else, and there's non-binary, and there's gender fluid, and there's all sorts of terms that we want to make sure that everyone feels included in this. So for the sake of today's programming, I'm going to simplify that. I'm going to be using LGBT. When I practiced doing this, I found that I was also using LGBTQ, and sometimes I was saying queer. So, but for the most part, I'm going to stick with LGBT for this afternoon's program. All right. So what are LGBT films and TV series? Or better yet, what makes a film or TV show gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender or non-binary or gender fluid or queer? What is it that makes that? So is it the creator? Is it somebody who's a producer or a writer or a director or filmmaker? So we just saw Janet Mock on Ellen. Janet Mock works for Ryan Murphy, and the Pose family works for Ryan Murphy. So Janet is a trans woman of color. She's a producer, a writer, director. Ryan Murphy is all four of these things. He's a gay man. So does that make their work LGBT? What about the characters that are in these films and TV shows? Does it have to be main characters in order to make it an LGBT film or TV series? What about supporting characters? And then there's the plot. Is it about people that are LGBT, or is it about the LGBT movement or the LGBT community? So is it about people trying to get marriage equality, a film from a while ago before marriage equality happened? Or is it about, or does the action take place in a gay bar? Is it about coming out? Or are the people, do they just happen to be LGBT, but the plot of the movie is not about that? And then there's something a little less clear and a little fuzzier, which is the overall feel of the show. But I also think that this is a part of this question. So we have a couple of things going on here. We have like a queer sensibility to a show. So in other words, when we look at the older films, when we start to dive into the 40s and 50s, we're going to be looking at a lot of films that had a queer sensibility to them. They weren't necessarily talking about LGBT characters, but the people were outsiders. They were considered other from the mainstream. So that's a queer sensibility. Also, it could be iconic characters or iconic actors. So especially, again, hearkening back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, there were a lot of iconic American actresses who were considered gay symbols or LGBT symbols. So there's that part of this question as well. And then finally, is the show camp? Is there camp involved in the show? So camp was really created by the LGBT community. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend's an example of camp. It's a typical sitcom, but suddenly it bursts into song and with big production numbers, and it's really over the top and it's hysterically funny. John Waters, who has had a huge career, his entire career is based upon camp. And ironically, Waters, who's an openly gay man, had very few LGBT characters in his films. Most of his films were really about twisting what he saw as the sort of perversion of suburbia. So he did that in really independent films in the early part of his career all the way through to his really big Hollywood films as well. And then, of course, RuPaul's Drag Race is sort of the ultimate camp TV show. So all of these things, really, that we're looking at, they can all feed into this definition of whether a show or a movie is gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. So in the really olden days, so now we're going to take a look at these decades that I talked about. So the first half of this is really going to go from the beginning of the film industry all the way to 1980. And the way that we're going to get there is we're going to look at a book that is really the quintessential book for LGBT film, and that is The Celluloid Closet, written by a film historian, Vito Russo. What Vito did was, in the 1970s, for about 10 years, he had a slideshow that he used to take to universities and to community centers, and he would do a presentation about all these different films with film clips, and he sort of looked at the underbelly or the hidden messages within films that were clues for LGBT people during these time periods when things were really closeted and really also illegal, for them to find some solace. And then also overarching themes of being villainous or being pitied, things that were really negative themes. So that happened in the 70s. In 1982, he published the first edition to this book. In 1987, Vito published a second edition to this book. And then, sadly, 3 years later, at the age of 44 years old, he died of AIDS. There was a documentary made of this film that happened in '95, and that took place 5 years after his death. So the book is really the inspiration for this program this evening. So we're going to use some really great overarching themes from the book, from the 40s through the 80s. And then once we leave that era and we're sort of on our own, we're going to take all of that we learned and apply it to the 90s and 2000s and the 2010s. So that's how we're going to get through this afternoon. All right, so according to Vito, there were three things that, when Hollywood depicted homosexuality on the screen, it was in three different categories. So it was rarely depicted, but when it was either pitied, like in Suddenly Last Summer. It was laughed at. Here's a still from a 1933 film called Our Betters, with a very fey waiter. Or feared, as in Rebecca from 1940, which is a Hitchcock film. The housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, is in the background in the black dress. And it's never said that she's a lesbian, but that she's very menacing. And she's also kind of obsessed with the deceased wife's underwear in one scene, in one particular scene. That's really a classic scene. So whether it's 1920 or 2020, Hollywood usually follows a very strict code for gender and sexuality. So a lot of the big budget films continue to reinforce these ideas of gender and sexuality stereotypes, and it's pretty easy to see this. So here's two images of two very famous actors in very famous roles. So in the movies, a woman is a woman and a man is a man, and there's not a lot of getting around any of that. As far as sexuality goes, it's really not sexuality in movies, it's predominantly heterosexuality in movies. And here's an example from 2016. La La Land was, to me, is like the perfect example of that. So it's white, cisgender, heterosexual, younger, lean images or characters that are coming together for this love story. Susie Bright, the sex therapist, says, we learn from the movies what it means to be a man or a woman, what it means to have sexuality. The movies reinforced stereotypes. And to understand a little bit more about that double standard between heterosexual films and non-heterosexual films, there's a really great documentary called This Film Has Yet to Be Rated from Kirby Dick. So please check that out. It talks about the differences between the rating system when it comes to straight films as opposed to gay films. Really, really great. Hollywood, though, I don't want to get down we're not going to go down to this negativity, because really a lot of good things have been happening. And in the last year, in particular, and with help from the streaming services, for sure, Hollywood's definitely listening. So last year we had our very first foreign language film from South Korea, Parasite, won Best Picture. And what I feel is the best independent film released last year was The Last Black Man in San Francisco, which was a really great indie film about a young African-American man living in San Francisco. He is straight. He's trying to get his house back that he had when he was a child from his family home. So it's a film about gentrification. It's a film about class. It's a film about race. But the great thing that I love about this film is that its two lead characters are heterosexual men who are really intimate and affectionate with each other and are not afraid to do that. So they really sort of bust open that idea of what it means to be a man in 2019 when the film was released. So two really great examples of where all of this is heading. So historically, Hollywood has reinforced stereotypes, and so much so that even our animated characters reinforce stereotypes. So here's a picture of The Lion King. The character Scar from 1994 was a sissy. Call Her Savage. This is an image of a film from 1932. So there was the archetype of the sissy that was very popular and continues to be popular. Now, the thing that we want to keep in mind when we think about images of gender in particular is that when men dress up like women, everyone laughs. So this is an image from Some Like It Hot in 1959. This is another image from Morocco from 1930. And when women dress up like men, no one laughs. So why is that? Well, it's because in the patriarchy, it's preferable to be male. So if men are acting like men, they're rewarded. If women act like men, they're actually rewarded to some degree. But if men act like women, they're put down and they're ostracized and perhaps even hurt. 1938's Bringing Up Baby was the very first time the reference of the word gay was used to connotate sexuality. And ironically, it was Cary Grant who did that in 32 in this film. He is in a woman's bathrobe. It's morning. There's an elderly woman that comes knocking at the back door in this scene, and she is horrified that he's in this bathrobe. And so in order to explain it to her, he said, "Because I just went gay all of a sudden." And that's the first time that that's used in the movie theater. We can't talk about the 40s and the 50s and even the 60s without talking about the Hays Code. So the Hays Code came about in 1930. There was a guy named Will Hays. He was the Postmaster General and somehow got the job as the president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. So basically, all the way through the late 60s, he and the organization created this very strong restrictive code that kept filmmakers from really being artists and really telling stories in a way that they wanted to tell it. So there was a huge list of things that you could not put into films. Number 4 was restricted any inference of sexual perversion, and sexual perversion meant anything that's under our modern day LGBT umbrella, anything about gender, anything about sexuality. So this image here of Stephen Boyd and Charlton Heston and Ben-Hur was one of the pictures that was really, could not actually come out and say what it wanted to say. It was very coded. So that is part of the issue. So in regards to that, if you are cisgender or heterosexual, or imagine for a moment that you are, if you're not, imagine never seeing yourself represented in film, television, or on the internet. And that's really what was going on during those decades. There was literally no representation, or if there was, it was absolutely foul. It was either implied, or if it was stated, it was disgusting. So visibility is crucial. It's crucial for all of us, no matter what identity we come to feel is our identity, or the number of identities that we combine together to make our whole identity. All of those things, we need reassurance, and we need representation, and we need visibility in our films that we watch. So for better or worse, the LGBT community's relationship with Hollywood has been a long dysfunctional marriage. And so that's what we're going to get into now. So we, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to use very broad strokes during the first couple of decades to show how LGBT representation has been happened in each of the decades, starting with the 1940s all the way up to the present time. So when I talk about the first couple of decades, I'm going to give one example of one film, but then there will be a couple of other films listed for you to jot down or remember so that you can check out later on. And hopefully, as we get closer and closer, you'll have more and more films that you're going to want to look at, because we'll be providing more and more content as we get closer to the present day. So the 1940s gave us lots of villains, and because it was the beginning of the Hays Code, or the sort of the meat of the Hays Code, it was very difficult to figure this out. Regular people that, well, when I say regular people, I mean heterosexual people that were at the movies didn't even give this a thought. But those of us who were living in the shadows, or were maybe even gay, knew our friends were out to our friends during this time period, but were also very worried because of laws that were on the books that we could be arrested and put into jail. We could see things through these films. And so Rebecca, as I mentioned earlier, was a great representation of that. The Maltese Falcon from 1941, or Hitchcock's Rope from 1944 is another great representation. My backdrop in where I'm at is, that's actually an image, it's a still from the film Rope. So that's what you're looking at when you see my backdrop. The 50s, well, the 50s were a lot different because the 50s were post-World War II. And one of the things that happened at the end of World War II was that the men, predominantly the men that were in the war, came back from the war and took away the jobs that a lot of the women had during the war. So there was a big shift in pushing people out of a lifestyle that they maybe had started to enjoy. So women were supposed to go back to the home, were supposed to just raise children, men were supposed to be the breadwinners. And so there was a real push in media, as well as in politics, as well as everywhere else, to reinforce this so that everything would get back to what they considered to be normal. And it ended up being a very repressive decade and time period for a lot of people. So the film Tea and Sympathy is a great example of that from 1956. The lead character is not gay at all. The lead character just isn't masculine enough. So he has to be taught what it means to be masculine and how he can be more of a man. So that's an absolute iconic representation of the 50s repression. Rebel Without a Cause is another great example of this. Ben-Hur, which I mentioned earlier, and Tennessee Williams' Suddenly Last Summer in 1959, also a really great example of that. So Arthur Lawrence, who wrote West Side Story, who was an openly gay man during a time period where it was difficult to be, said once, nobody ever sees the same movie. And so this really ties into what I mentioned earlier about seeing things through your own lens. So each of us sees film and television through our own specific and unique set of identities and the way we see the world. And so with Lawrence, he was talking specifically about LGBT content and film before, in the days like this. This is going to be an example from 1948 that I'm going to show you. So it was long before there was actually openly gay characters in anything. So you had to really look at the subtext, and a lot of what Russo talks about in his book, The Celluloid Closet, a lot of it is about inference and subtext in the movies. So this is a great example. This is actually a serious, straightforward scene that if you're watching it with sort of a queer eye, you can get a much better understanding of this and actually laugh through the whole, it ends up being a pretty funny scene. But for the majority of the audience, this just looked like a scene with two cowboys in it. So let's take a look at this. This is, let's see, sorry about that. This is John Ireland and Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift, obviously a huge star.
Let's give my hand over here. It's a good-looking gun you were about to use back there. Can I see it? Maybe you'd like to see mine. Nice, awful nice. You know, there are only two things more beautiful than a good gun. A Swiss watch or a woman from anywhere. You ever had a good Swiss watch? Go ahead, try it. Yeah, that's very good. Hey, that's good too. Come on, keep it going. Yeah, now I know who you'd be. You'd be Matthew Garth, wouldn't you? That's right. You're as good as they say you are. Maybe as good as me. That puts two of us at the head of the list. I'd leave room for a third. Yeah? Who? Benson? Is he that good? Not me. Yeah.
So that's Red River from 1948 with John Ireland and Montgomery Clift. And as you can see, probably the majority of the audience at the time watched that scene and didn't even think about it. But those of us who were in the know can watch that scene and actually be titillated by it, or we can be amused by it, one or the other. But it's a great, great example of really looking and digging deep into these films from the past and seeing the subtext that sort of creates this catalog of films that really ends up being part of LGBTQ history. We jump into the 60s now, and the 60s was still repressive for LGBT folk, but there were some great films that started to really push the Hays Code and the repression that was happening, not just in the US, but around the world. In 1961, there was a British film called Victim, which is an incredible, incredible film to watch for so many reasons, but it was the very first mention of same-sex desire by a character. So Dirk Bogarde starred in this film, and he plays a lawyer who is representing gay men who are being blackmailed, and he himself has same-sex desires and ends up having an affair with someone. And this is the actress that's in this shot with him plays his wife. And this scene is really intense because he admits to her that he has feelings for other men. And it's the very first time, like literally in the history of filmmaking, that this happened. So the fact that it happened in 61 and that the movie holds up so well is just really, really great. There were also some other films during this time period, some of them good, some of them, you know. The Children's Hour was an adaptation of Lillian Hellman's play. It came out also in 61. It starred Shirley MacLaine and Audrey Hepburn. And the play talked a lot about lesbianism and was really sort of straightforward about same-sex female desire. The movie, of course, had to deal with the Hays Codes because the Hays Code still had not gotten busted up yet. And so literally there was no mention of it. And to watch the movie, it's almost confusing at certain points. If you look at it knowing the history of the film and the play, it's easy to sort of interpret. But if you look at it with sort of a blind set of eyes, you're kind of like, what is going on with this film? Two other films that were completely different, and of course, we're at the end of that decade. So that decade is really the decade that burst open a lot of doors for a lot of different movements. And obviously Stonewall happened at the end of this decade. So 1968's The Killing of Sister George, which was again another British film. And then 1970, The Boys in the Band. I've included that in the 60s because Boys in the Band was a play on a theater play in New York City during that time period in the late 60s. So both of those films had open gay characters that were living their lives openly. Now these characters may not have been necessarily positive characters, but for what they were fully fleshed out lesbians and gay men, bisexual women. So it's a really interesting sort of shift that's happening right now. And of course, a lot of it has to do with the 60s in general. Just everything was changing for a lot of people. So all of those films, really good to check out. The 70s, we went from being victims to being victimizers. So it was sort of this idea of gay people being having no strength to gay people being sort of users and abusers. But there were some really great films that came out of the 70s that, again, sort of heralded this late 60s movement and continued the momentum of that. 1972, the film Cabaret came out. Cabaret was based on Christopher Isherwood's Berlin stories, which was turned into a play called I Am Camera, and then the film Cabaret. So for a look into someone who lived out and proud before Stonewall, I would suggest reading Isherwood's diaries of his life with his longtime love, Don Bacardi. They really are a glimpse into somebody that was living during this time period, that was not following the rules. He was making up his own rules, and really was a trailblazer for LGBT rights, as well as being a great writer on his own. A number of other films. John Waters started producing these really no-budget films that put him on the map. So Female Trouble came out during this decade. The Rocky Horror Picture Show came out during this decade, which has stood the test of time. La Cage aux Folles was a French film that had 2 sequels. So there were 3 films in French. There was a Broadway show, and then they made an American remake of La Cage called Birdcage with Nathan Lane and Robin Williams. So La Cage sort of created a whole brand onto itself. And then something that I love to mention that some people don't remember is that Meryl Streep's first role was in Woody Allen's Manhattan, and she actually plays Allen's ex-wife, and she's an open lesbian, has a partner, they're raising Woody Allen's kid. And the interesting thing is that Woody Allen sort of complains and makes jokes about the lesbians throughout the whole film, typical sort of, you know, like straight man posturing. But as with almost all of Allen's films, the joke is on his character because they really have their act together. The 2 women are really, you know, together, they're happy, they're successful, and they're a unit. So it was really an interesting, it wasn't a huge role, but for what the amount of time that they were on camera, it was really a great representation. So we leave the 70s, and as we begin to look at the beginning of the 80s, we have something going on here. Things are really starting to change. The Hays Code has been busted out completely, excuse me. And Hollywood is starting to really take chances on things. So there's 2 movies in particular that happened that I want to talk about, and then a number of other films during the course of that decade as well that are really good to look at. And keeping in mind that during this time period is when AIDS was really ramping up in the early part of the 80s and the mid 80s. So, really, the shift was going to happen very quickly. But there's some films that were made early on that were probably in production during when the AIDS was just starting to hit. And so let's talk about all of that. So the first film I want to mention is the film called Making Love. Making Love came out in 1982. It was the first film that really tackled a gay male experience. There is, and also a love triangle with a woman involved. And so it was a very, very sort of forward thinking, and sort of, it busted a lot of stereotypes. So it came out, and this was the poster. I wanted to show this because this was the actual poster for Making Love. Very interesting. So I don't think there's ever been a movie poster that's ever been made that's had a disclaimer on as part of the movie poster. So the producers and the distributors were so freaked out that people were not going to want to go see this film because it involved 2 men being intimate with each other, that they put a disclaimer on it. So this is Making Love from 1982. So much has changed in the last 38 years. I give an example of Love, Victor here, which is the sequel to Love, Simon that's coming out later this year. And of course, all the hype on this is just celebratory and matter of fact and happy. And so it really was like Making Love kind of had to take this hit in order for us to get here 38 years later. And the other film that happened in Hollywood that same year in 1982 was Personal Best. So Personal Best came along and was sort of the female version of Making Love. So these films sort of stand on their own and also together as a set. So Making Love dealt with a male experience of sexuality, and Personal Best dealt with a female version of that. The interesting thing is that if you look at this in the time period that it happened, and also look at it in the context of the patriarchy, all of the drama that surrounded Making Love did not surround Personal Best at all. And obviously that's because women's intimacy with each other is seen by the patriarchy and by straight men in general as something that's either erotic or a prelude to being with men. So there's not a threat or a disgust either with female sexuality in that regard. So this picture was a lot better received than than Making Love was. The 80s did continue to surprise us. There's some really great films that came out of the 80s. Definitely in my top 10 of all-time movies of all-time favorite films of all time is Victor Victoria from 1982. I've watched this film over and over again, and I've watched it recently, and it holds up, and it's funny, and it's comical, and it's a farce, and it's a musical, and it's, yes, it's the two leads are heterosexual, or I shouldn't say the two leads, because Robert Preston is actually one of the leads, and he plays a gay man. But if you look at the love story, the main love story is between Julie Andrews and James Garner. And obviously they're white and they're straight. But if you look at everybody that's around them and everything that happens to them over the course of this movie, they question their own gender and sexuality throughout the whole course of this film. And so that's what makes this, I think, just this celebratory, funny, gorgeous, beautiful film that really stands the test of time. 1985 brought us Desert Hearts, which was, it's considered a classic lesbian drama. It just it's a wonderful film. Takes place in the late 1950s, and it's an affair between a divorced woman and a younger woman. Really lovely film. My Beautiful Laundrette came out the same year from Britain. This is a Stephen Frears film. Frears is a great filmmaker that's had a wonderful career. He did a film about two men having a relationship. They're young men, so there was a combination here of a lot of different things. There was a punk, sort of the punk era was around, and so there's a punk element to the movie. There's class, and it's an interracial romance. So, and it was really heralded as a wonderful, wonderful film. And it was also one of the two films that Daniel Day-Lewis did that year that were breakout films for him and gave him his career. And then in 87, possibly my favorite film of all time, not just favorite LGBT film of all time, but literally favorite film, is Morris from Merchant Ivory. So in 1987, Merchant Ivory, which was a very successful producer, director team, two men, they were partners in life, romantically, and they were partners at work as well. And they did a series of really great films over the course of this time period. And a number of them were E.M. Forster adaptations of his novels, and they decided to take on Morris. Morris is fascinating because Forster wrote this back in the early part of the 20th century, but he did not want to publish it because he was afraid it would be trashed. He wanted it to wait until maybe society was more accepting of this. So the book literally did not get published until 1970 by Christopher Isherwood, who Forster gave the rights to before he died. Isherwood published it in 1970. It was a hit, and a literary hit, and then Merchant Ivory decided to take a chance on this in 87, and they made this film, and it was absolutely gorgeous. So in 2017, I had the great honor, I would say, of seeing the 30th anniversary, a brand new 4K cut of this at the Quad Cinema in New York City, and James Ivory was in attendance and did a Q&A afterwards. The following year, Ivory won his very first Oscar for Call Me By Your Name. He wrote the screenplay for Call Me By Your Name. He was 89 years old at the Oscars in 2018. So just really a huge, huge trailblazer. And you may be thinking, because we've gotten pretty far into this, and I haven't mentioned television yet. So here's my first comment on television. Television is going to get more and more as we get into this. It's actually going to take over towards the end. But there's not a whole lot to say about the 50s and the 60s. But once we get into the 70s and 80s, there's a lot to say. And again, to try to keep a brevity to this so that we have time to really focus on things that are more and more current, I'm going to point you to a really great podcast to watch. This guy's name is Matt Baum. He does wonderful podcasts, and he has one called the Sewers of Paris podcast. And in this, a couple years ago, he grabbed a whole bunch of clips and did 7 minutes on the 70s and 80s in LGBT television, and it's wonderful, and it's on YouTube. you can subscribe to him or you can just watch it. And it's really great. It goes through all of the big network, you know, All in the Family, The Golden Girls, MASH, Cheers. It goes through all of them, and it's really, really comprehensive. And he's a great historian as well. So check that out. We are actually not going to play that. We're going to zoom through. So I mentioned AIDS earlier and HIV. So as the 80s were moving forward and all those really wonderful films that we've just talked about were coming out, we also had the AIDS crisis happening. And so what happened was towards the middle or towards the end of the 1980s, a shift happened in film and television. And a shift happened where we started looking at films from the lens of health and from the lens of grief. And so a number of films came out. Interestingly enough, as we got into the 1990s, the AIDS films continued, but they also happened simultaneously with what's called the new queer cinema movement of the 1990s, which we'll get to in a minute. So let's talk about a couple of AIDS films. So Longtime Companion from 1990 was adaptation from a play. Philadelphia came out in 1993, and that's really Hollywood making an AIDS film. So Philadelphia was written by gay screenwriter Ron Neiswaner. This film was not a film for the LGBT community. A lot of people watched it, but it really was a film created specifically for a straight audience, for a mainstream audience, for the audience that would come to see a movie in a mall, at a movie theater, at a big movie theater. And it worked. Before this film, there was a lot of confusion and a lot of negativity about HIV and the AIDS epidemic, and also the LGBT community. And Philadelphia really started helping just people in general sort of crack that veneer of bigotry and start to really understand that this was a human disease that had humans involved in it. And this film really helped that a lot. I saw this film. I don't really love this film in particular. I think there's a lot of problems with the film, but that's because I'm looking at it from my lens with all of my identities. When you look at this from either a cisgender or heterosexual viewpoint, it really makes a lot more sense. And then to jump all the way to the present with films about HIV and AIDS, in 2017, a French filmmaker made an incredible feature film called BPM, Beats Per Minute. And he wrote a film and directed a film about the 1990s ACT UP Paris time period. And this film really captures what it was like to go through this time period. I lived through this time period. I'm positive, so I know what it was like to be worried about death during this time period. But also my negative friends, we all were in this together. And BPM really captures, and there was an odd combination of like despair and anger and frustration and longing and pride even, and also hope and love and eroticism, and all of that sort of got meshed together, because a lot of the people that this was affecting were really young people, really young, vibrant people. So BPM really captures that, and I really can't recommend this film enough. I just think it's a fantastic film. I have on my website, on my blog, I have a list of what I consider to be the best HIV and AIDS films. There are quite a few of them, and they're all very different. Some are documentaries, some are musicals, some are foreign language films, and they're all sort of over the map, but they're all just really interesting to watch. So if you have any sort of interest in that area of filmmaking and that time period, check out this list on Real Charlie. So as I mentioned, as we move towards the 1990s, another film movement began, and that was what has been termed New Queer Cinema. So New Queer Cinema happened during the 1990s, and basically it was a group of young filmmakers, independent filmmakers, that were making films on their own terms, and they were rejecting the heteronormativity of everything that they saw in the past. So all of those films that we talked about from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, they just said, this is bullshit and we're gonna make our own films. And so that's what happened with New Queer Cinema. So out of this decade came some of the most vibrant films that have ever been seen surrounding LGBT identity. Tongues Untied is the first one that I have listed here. It is directed by Marlon Riggs, and it really is about the experiences of gay men of color during this time period. Poison from 1991 is a Todd Haynes film. Todd Haynes is responsible for Far From Heaven and for Velvet Goldmine and for Carol. I'll be talking a little bit later about Far From Heaven and Carol with Todd Haynes. So this was a great triptych, 3 short stories about, and with a lot of parallels to the AIDS crisis at the time. Go Fish came out in 1994, which is a super beautiful, celebratory, lesbian rom-com that was just delicious and filmed in black and white and celebratory and absolutely fabulous. Also in 96, during this decade, Cheryl Dunye's film, The Watermelon Woman, came out, which I have to say is in my top 10 of favorite films of all time. Dunye really hit it out of the park. It's sort of a hybrid film, what I kind of call a hybrid film. It's not one particular genre. So it's a rom-com, it's a lesbian independent film, it's an interracial romance film, it's an indie film, and it's historical drama as well, all sort of made, you know, tied up together in a really great bow. And it takes place in a video store in the 80s in Philadelphia, so what's not to love about that? And then in the 1990s, as all of this was happening, so the AIDS crisis was in, you know, it was just at its peak. So there were films being made about the AIDS crisis and about AIDS. There were also all of the new queer cinema films that were happening. And Hollywood was also catching up, which was very hopeful. So we had Gus Van Zant's My Own Private Idaho came out in 1991. Bound came out in 1996. Which was very interesting because it was a lesbian, very sultry sort of mystery suspense movie. And I think that it really was the perfect blend of, it appealed to the lesbian audience with their identity and also appealed very strongly to sort of sexy, straight male, straight couple sort of audience. So it kind of brought a lot of disparate groups together and helped to make this a huge hit. So, let me go back for a second and take a breath. So that's the 1990s, a lot of different things happening in the 1990s. I mentioned earlier that as we get more and more closer and closer to the present day, TV is going to start to take over more and more. And so that's the point in this program where that really happens. So my next slide is the 2000s. And instead of starting off with films for the 2000s, I have to start off with television, because this is really the moment where queer characters, queer representation, and just really celebratory writing was made about LGBT lives and characters came about in the 2000s. It started in the 2000s and it has only gotten better since then. So there's basically 4 different shows that happened in the 2000s, and let's get into it. So Queer as Folk happened from 2000 to 2005. It was an import from the British TV series. So there was a short-lived, just a season and a half maybe, of a TV series that was really in your face and had a lot of, it was very sexy, and it was very sort of like, you know, didn't take any prisoners, and people loved it over in Britain. So 2 producers in the US purchased the rights to it and turned it into a TV show in the US, and it became a huge hit for Showtime. And it also was the marker of the first TV show that had predominantly all gay characters, and in particular all gay male characters. Now there's been a lot of criticism about Queer as Folk, about inclusivity. If you look at this photo of all of the characters, obviously this cast is all white and it's all cisgender. So there was a lot of complaints as the years went by. But I really do feel like if you look at these 4 examples from 2000, you will see that there are connections to this in what we have in our present day with things that we're watching, movies or TV shows like Pose, and TV shows like Special from Netflix, and all kinds of different things that are happening on streaming. It's all because these shows took a chance. They still fell into a stereotype, but they took a chance and they really sort of expanded that that possibility for other people to come along and do other things. I love Queer as Folk. I have loved it since it started, and I've watched it over and over again. I still own it. I own the whole series on DVDs. I love it. I absolutely love it. At the same time, HBO, and remember, Queer as Folk on Showtime, HBO premiered at the same time, and it ran for the same amount of years from 2000 to 2005, 6 Feet Under. Full disclosure, 6 Feet Under is my favorite TV show of all time. I also own that on DVD or Blu-ray as well. And I love, love, love 6 Feet Under. So 6 Feet Under was very different from Queer as Folk. Queer as Folk was very frothy and very in your face and over the top at times, and kind of had almost a soap opera feel to it. 6 Feet Under was very much an ensemble piece of serious drama. And the thing about 6 Feet Under was that the LGBT element was that there was a family of morticians, and one of the sons, if you look at the photo that we're looking at, the two actors on the right of that photo, so David is the Caucasian son, and his partner Keith is African American. So that couple went through the whole 2000s for 5 years with this TV series. And the great thing about that couple was that David wasn't even out of the closet when the series starts. And then by the end, they have gotten married and they have adopted children, and it's just been a really great ride for them. So it was two very different experiences, but both really welcome to audiences. Angels in America, HBO hit out of the park with in 2003. So Angels in America was a show that was based on Tony Kushner's Pulitzer Prize winning play that's in 2 parts on Broadway, and HBO produced the miniseries. It was a huge success. I have a note on here on this slide if you want to learn more about Angels and the background to it, or also want to learn more about HBO's involvement in LGBT history with their shows. Check out Manuel Betancourt's HBO LGBT history on his website. It's a fantastic, he does essays on each of the shows that have been on from 1988 all the way to the present. It's really a phenomenal body of work. And then in 2004, Showtime decided, if we had a gay male show and it did so well, let's have a lesbian show. And so in 2004, and ran for 6 years, The L Word happened. And The L Word was, again, a huge hit. I, again, love this show. I've watched this show when it first came out, and then I watched it again all the way through maybe 2 years ago. It has a remake that just started last year called The L Word Generation Q, and they're having a 2nd season in 2020 as well. Again, there were complaints about The L Word and its diversity. So there were some people of color, although they were not particularly noticeable. If you look at this, there's some Latinx representation, there is African American representation, but it still does not look particularly diverse. And what I think a lot of people complained about was really the push towards the femme part of the lesbian experience. And also there was a trans character that was also somewhat controversial in it as well. But again, I have to come back to that idea, which I do firmly believe in, which is that these shows opened up a window so that other filmmakers and other showrunners could come along and create other types of experiences. And I think that's where we all have to build on. We kind of have to go from the majority and then go to a different majority and then go to a minority and then keep including people until everyone's stories are being heard and are being accessible to all of us and are being welcomed. So I think the L Word did a fantastic job. The networks also came out with a lot of shows with LGBT content. Will and Grace actually started before Queer as Folk did, so they started in 1998. It was a very watered down sitcom, very classic sitcom, but a lot of people loved it. And it ran until 2006, and then it came back for 3 seasons just recently and just ended this year. Modern Family came out in 2009. And then Peter Page, who played Emmett on Queer as Folk, became a showrunner and started a series with his writing partner called The Fosters in 2013. And that ran for a number of years and now has a sequel as well. And that was a great story about a family of natural and adopted and foster children that were a blended family that was helmed by 2 women. So really, really great, great stories. The 2000s did have movies. We've talked a lot about television, but the 2000s did have films. And there's 3 themes that I see in the 2000s. One is that we saw a lot of LGBT content coming out of different countries, which was great because, again, just like that monsoon wedding idea that I talked about earlier, it's wonderful to watch LGBT content from other cultures and other parts of the world because you get a glimpse into a world that you may never even experience at all, but that will, again, enrich and sort of open up your own personal world. Indie films also began to thrive, and then a lot of the people from the new queer cinema movement began working inside the Hollywood system. So people like Todd Haynes started making bigger budget films during this time period. So Presque Rien is a French film that I love that came out in 2000. It's called Come Undone, and that's a wonderful film. It's definitely very French and very independent. John Cameron Mitchell's off-Broadway play Hedwig and the Angry Inch just turned into a musical film, and Cameron Mitchell starred in it. It's just a wonderful, crazy, over-the-top glam rock musical with a trans lead in it. The play itself was revived on Broadway in 2014 with a lot of different people playing the lead role. So there was that as well. And then I mentioned Todd Haynes earlier. So Far From Heaven came out in 2002, which I believe is really his masterpiece. Alongside of Carol, I think they sit very well together. Far From Heaven was really an homage to Douglas Sirk, who was a filmmaker in the 1950s. And then what Todd Haynes did was he infused modern themes of race and sexuality into Far From Heaven to make it, even though it seemed like it was an old-fashioned movie, it was very modern as far as its what it dealt with. And then, boom, 2005 and Brokeback Mountain happens. So what makes Brokeback Mountain similar movie to Philadelphia? Well, I believe that Hollywood made Brokeback Mountain, and Brokeback Mountain connected with mainstream audiences the same way Philadelphia did. So it did the same thing for sexuality that Philadelphia did for the AIDS crisis. So again, I don't think that Brokeback Mountain was made for the LGBT community. I think it was really made for the mainstream community to get a handle on this homophobia that was really prevalent, especially with men and male relationships. The Oscars disagreed with how popular this was. Brokeback lost to Traffic, but I think a lot of film historians since then really feel like Brokeback was the movie that should have won that year. I'm going to ask a question now, and I don't have an answer to it, but I just want to throw it out there to you. So a lot of people talk about Brokeback Mountain being about 2 gay men, but I wonder are these characters of Jack and Ennis really repressed gay men, or are they bisexual men? And did some of that conversation about gay men, was that by erasure that happened during Brokeback Mountain's run? So that's just a question to think about. And then we get up to that last decade that's happened right before our eyes over the last 10 years. So 2010 to 2019. Couple of themes: trans stories finally get a voice and find funding with trans actors and filmmakers. So films about trans stories, and then also TV shows as well. Gender takes a center stage. So the Me Too movement and Time's Up, especially for female gender, really takes the stage on that. And then television binging ends up usurping going to the movie theater. So there's a huge shift with watching television over going to the movie theater, which is why, as we're going through this, you're seeing more and more conversations about TV shows rather than films. Until we get to the very end, we're going to see it's almost predominantly television. All that said, there's a bunch of great stuff that happened in the 2010s. So let's jump into it. So there was a movie in 2011 called Pariah, which I have to talk about because it was a film by a brand new filmmaker, African-American lesbian filmmaker, Dee Rees. It was her directorial debut. She did a short film, and then she created a feature-length film. So this was a movie about an African-American high school student, a young girl living in the Bronx. She's in a middle-class household, and she is trying to figure out her place in her world. She's trying to figure out her place in her family, in her life, but also in lesbian culture. She's sneaking out and going to the lesbian clubs, and all of the gender in the lesbian clubs is very codified. It's very butch and femme, and she feels like she doesn't really fit into either of those extremes, and what does that mean for her future? It's just an absolutely glorious film. Dee went on to do Bessie with Queen Latifah, and also Mudbound, which was an adaptation of a novel. Really great films all around, so yay for that. Also during this time period, starting in about 2008 and going to 2012, it was ramping up to the 30th anniversary of the discovery of the HIV virus, and there were a number of really great documentaries that came out that chronicled this time period. And the one that most people remember is How to Survive a Plague in 2012. It was nominated for an Oscar. It really talked about ACT UP in New York City and the activism movement and how it really changed a lot of things for a lot of people, for HIV and AIDS patients, as well as the whole medical industry in general. At the 59-minute mark, there is a still, and that's the still that you're looking at, and that guy that's in the red shirt right there, that's me from a, we were at a demo in 1991, I think it was Labor Day. We were at Kenny Bunkport, which was the home of George Bush, not the George Bush one, the father one, George Bush one. It was at his summer home, and I never expected to be in this. I was not one of the leaders of any sort of movement. I was just one of the foot soldiers. So I watched this film and I kept looking for everybody that I knew who were the big wigs in ACT UP and in activism in New York City. And I didn't see hardly anyone except boom at the 59-minute mark. I'm like, is that me? And sure enough, it is. So the last 5 years, or actually the last 6 years, a lot has happened, and I feel like what I'd like to do is just highlight some things that I really loved rather than talk about overarching themes, because I feel like at this point now, it's like you might be hungry for more titles. So on my blog, I do a year-end list of my favorite stuff for every year for the last 10 years. So I took that year-end list for the last 6 years and I pulled out all the films and TV shows that have LGBT content. So let's get started. 2014 gave us 2 wonderful films. One is another French film called Stranger by the Lake. It's a great mystery, very atmospheric. It also is one of the few films that has unsimulated or real sex in it, even though it's not a porn film, it's an actual feature film. There's been a number of these films, mostly European, that have done this, and most of them have been heterosexual films. But Stranger by the Lake is another one of those films, and John Cameron Mitchell, who did Hedwig, we talked about that earlier, his film Short Bus also had unsimulated sex in it as well. And then Reaching for the Moon is a lovely lesbian independent film based on a true story of the poet Elizabeth Bishop, and she had a love affair with the architect Loda de Maceda Soares, and that movie is just gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous movie. And then 3 TV shows to think about for 2014. The Fosters, which I mentioned earlier, premiered. Looking came out on HBO, which was a very short-lived TV series about a number of gay men who are best friends living in San Francisco in 2014 and what that means. And I love that, really, really love that series. And then Transparent came out. Transparent came out to rave reviews in 2014. As most of us know, it ended in absolute, it was a disaster the way it ended because of the star Jeffrey Tambor and the allegations against him. I do want to say that I loved this series all the way through, and I watched it and I cheered for it, and I think it did a lot of good. I'm sorry that it ended up the way that it did, but I do think, again, like we're talking about this progression of going from, you know, the majority to, you know, a smaller majority to a minority to really, you know, stories that are about all different kinds of people. I don't think Pose would have happened if we wouldn't have first had Transparent, because we learned a lot of lessons of what not to do. And then Ryan Murphy and Janet Mock came along and did it right with Pose. So there's that. 2015, we have a couple of great movies. The Imitation Game, which was a big British film that was about Alan Turing. Alan Turing was one of the people that helped to break the code, the German code in World War II to help win the war, and also was the creator of the modern computer. So he was an open, well, he wasn't, I don't know if I'd call him openly gay, but he was a gay man, and he ended up committing suicide later in life. Very sad, and but his story was just remarkable. So that was told. Also, a film called Still Alice came out, which Julianne Moore won Best Actor for that year. There were two directors on that. Richard Gleitzer, it was his final film, and his partner, his life partner, romantic partner, as well as his directing partner, Wash Westmoreland. They did this film together. It was adapted from a novel. This is one of those films that, if we think about earlier on, like what makes something LGBT, so this is the creators. There's no LGBT content in this film, but I do think that there's a queer sensibility to this film because of Gleitzer and Washmoreland's their combined, their synergy and their connection together. And unfortunately, Gleitzer died of Lou Gehrig's disease shortly after the film was released. Very sad, but great, great film. Absolutely suggest watching it. Tangerine came out that year. Tangerine was probably the best indie of the year that year. Definitely in my book was absolutely the best. It was filmed on an iPhone, and the two characters are trans women of color in LA. And they're in the sex industry. And so it's just a really interesting film that pushes a lot of buttons, pushes a lot of boundaries, and I think really comes out on top. 2016 was a pretty quiet year, but two really beautifully intimate films came out. Todd Haynes, I mentioned him quite a few times before. He came out with the absolute gorgeous Carol, which was an adaptation of a novel. And it's a 1950s drama about two women falling in love, just absolutely beautiful. And the same year, Barry Jenkins created Moonlight, and Moonlight went on to be the surprise hit, literally the surprise hit at the Oscars. And again, this is an absolute beautiful independent film about a young gay Black male coming of age, 3 actors playing him at different times in his life, and just really, really stunning, and a must-see if you haven't seen it yet. In 2017, we have I Am Not Your Negro, a documentary on James Baldwin, which is an immediate classic. And then another French film. I know I've talked about a lot of French films. That's not really on purpose. I like a lot of films from all over the world. I like Israeli films. I like Spanish films. I like Argentine films. I don't know what happened, but I ended up listing a lot of French films. This is fun. It's really sexy. It's like the premise is that it's these two guys that pick each other up, and then they go home together, and then they end up spending a day together, and it's kind of like, is this going to go further or is it not? Really, really beautiful, fun, sexy, very real, lots of great shots of the streets in Paris at like 4 in the morning. Really cool. And then in 2018, everything kind of blew up. So there was a lot of great content in 2018. So I mentioned BPM, the HIV/AIDS movie that takes place in the 1990s. God's Own Country came out, which was from rural Yorkshire, England. It came out the same year as Call Me By Your Name came out. Notice that's not on my list. I'm not a big fan of that film. I really feel like God's Own Country was the gay male love story of the year for that year. And if you haven't seen that, it's an absolute treat. Check it out. Hannah Gadsby's one-woman show, Nanette, she did perform that live, and then Netflix did a special on it. And that also just blew up. I mean, it's lesbian, it's gender, it's stand-up, it's mental health. It's just all these different things, all sort of mashed up together and really incredible. Also, I went to New Fest in 2018, which is the New York City Gay and Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Film Festival. And I saw Rafiki, which was a Kenyan film about the power of lesbian love. Absolute, again, just a lovely, lovely film. Also, another great indie film, Women Who Kill. The creator, Ingrid Jungerman, has done some really great work over the years, and I thought this film was, again, a great independent film and another great reason to watch more lesbian content. Just really lovely. And then the Brits gave us Man in an Orange Shirt. It ended up being on Masterpiece Theater that year in 2018. It's 2 stories of 2 different time periods with 2 gay men, and again, it's kind of brilliant. So, and then finally last year we get Pose. So Pose, my year to watch Pose was 2019. It premiered on Netflix that year. I had no idea about it. I hadn't heard much about it, and I fell madly in love with it. So I've watched season 1 and season 2, and I'm chomping at the bit to see season 3. I lived in New York City during that time period. I never participated in ball culture. So to me, it's like watching New York City during my time in New York from a very completely different lens, from a lens of people, gay men of color, trans women of color, and it's just fascinating to me. Special also came out last year, and it's another absolutely glorious TV show. Ryan O'Connell. It's based on his experience of being a gay man living with cerebral palsy. It's funny and it's tragic and it's just hysterical. And then finally, Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City was remade for Netflix in 2019. So Armistead's been writing books since the 70s. He's written 9 books in the Tales series. There's been 3 other adaptations, and Netflix went ahead and took kind of parts from the last 3 books. And they also took a lot of liberties, and they created a lot of new characters, and it became this really inclusive gender and sexuality mashup in San Francisco in modern day. And it ended up, even though I was kind of like, they changed the books, I have to tell you, it was just a beautiful, beautiful series, and it still had all that magical magic. So absolutely lovely. And now let me talk a little bit about GLAAD, because I think this report is really something that is should be on everybody's radar. So the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, every year they do a TV report, and this year's report is called Where We Are on TV. It's an annual report of the state of LGBT representation on television. It's a huge report, and it has a lot of data in it. This is just one example of one of the pages. So this is the streaming networks, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, etc. So it breaks it down by sexual orientation of the characters, streaming services with character inclusion, and then gender identity of the trans characters. So just an amazing, amazing document, and something that you definitely want to look at. And then we get to the last couple of years and what's hit the Oscars and what hasn't hit the Oscars, and what was deserving of an Oscar nom or an Oscar win and what wasn't. So it's interesting, since 2016, we've kind of had this sort of march with the Oscars. So in 2016, Carol gets nominated for 6 Oscars, but not for Best Picture. And then in 2017, Moonlight wins Best Picture. 2018, the following year, Call Me By Your Name gets nominated for Best Picture, doesn't win. And then the following year, Green Book wins Best Picture. And also The Favorite and Bohemian Rhapsody are also nominated. And then this year, no queer nominations. Almodovar was snubbed for his autobiographical Pain and Glory. Speaking of foreign language films, Pedro Almodovar is my favorite living film director. He's a Spanish filmmaker. If you don't know his work, feel free to check with me, and I will be more than happy to start you on your journey of Almodovar genius. So a couple of things that I think are sort of 1 step forward, 2 steps back in relation to the Oscars. Call Me By Your Name had the nomination in 2018, and Green Book won in 2019. I have to ask the question, because I'm not a big Call Me By Your Name fan, so I have to ask the question, is Call Me By Your Name a film about 2 straight men who experiment? And if so, is that part of the LGBT umbrella? I have my opinion on that. I'm not going to say. I'm just going to ask the question. My other question is, did Green Book relegate the lead character's sexuality to a passing reference? So it talked about, you know, in the text, in the media, they talked about Green Book, about the lead character being gay, but it was a passing reference. And then finally, did Bohemian Rhapsody spend way more time focused on Freddie's straight sex scenes than it did on the gay sex scenes? And that's like a running thing that's happened for a long time. So, so there's that. And did Rocket Man do it better? Which I absolutely think it did. And again, do these questions matter? Just like those questions I asked at the opening. And I do think they do matter. I think that all of us can take our identities and our passions and have conversations with each other and enlighten each other, and also come to some agreement, and also to come to some not to agree on everything. And I think that's a really good thing, because I think it opens up conversation, and also it helps us all to evolve. So the future, where are we headed? What does the next 100 years in film and television and media hold? And what does the next 100 years in the LGBT umbrella hold? What about gender and sexuality? How is it going to change and mutate and grow and expand and include in the next 100 years? So as far as, I can't answer that question, but as far as media goes, I've got 5 articles on here from different sources that you can preview new queer films that are happening this year. A couple of them have been released, but most of them have not. You know, with COVID, a lot of this is happening, like a lot of things are getting pushed back, the release dates. So there's still a lot of films that are coming for this year and into next. And then I just want to make a comment about I want to acknowledge, so I want to go back to where it all began, to Vito Russo's book, The Celluloid Closet, which I could not have done this program without. The book is available through your library. It's also available used from Amazon or eBay. It is out of print, so you can only get a used version of it. And the documentary that the book was based on the book is available streaming on a lot of different platforms for $3 or $4. It's absolutely worth watching. It's just an incredible documentary. And then I have a number of resources listed. Some of them I've mentioned, some of them I've not, but all of these are worth going to. So feel free to do that as well. I do want to give a plug to my blog. So my blog is called Real Charlie, and you can get to it by going to realcharlie.com. I do have a favorite LGBT film list. I also have 30 Days of Gay. Back in 2015, I spent every day of June watching a different LGBT film or television series. So that's a lot of fun. There's a lot of gay content. You can search by that, by either gay or lesbian or transgender or bisexual. I have all different categories in there. And I do want to remind everyone of something that I've talked about through this entire event, which is that we always see things from our own perspective. Watching, listening, and sharing helps us expand. And that, again, is just something that we have to still constantly keep reminding ourselves of, so that we can grow as human beings and as members of the LGBT movement and allies. So I'd like to thank Triangle Community Center for this afternoon with you. I'd like for you to please consider donating to TCC. If you can, please text TCC Pride to the phone number 56651. Follow the prompts and make and pay for your donation. Your generous support helps. I'd like to thank Fairfield Public Library, my employer, for partnering with TCC to do this great event. It's been a lot of fun for me. My email address is down there. It's my first initial P and my last name is Bahr, B-A-H-R, @fplct.org. Or you can call TCC's office if you want to get a hold of me, and they'll be happy to get you in touch with Brian or Anna, and they can help find me. I want to thank everyone so much for spending this time with me. This is a huge passion of mine, and I love sharing it. If you have any questions or want to dig deeper with anything, please just contact me, and I'm thrilled to help out in any way I can. I'm going to pull out of the share function now. So here I am back again. Again, I'd like to thank all of you so much for spending time with us today. Happy Virtual Pride. Please continue to watch the other programs that are happening later on in the week. And best of luck to all of you out there. Be safe, be healthy, be happy, be thrilled, and watch lots of TV and movies. Bye, everybody.